Je donne maintenant la parole au très honorable Premier ministre.
The right honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the night before this House last rose, Canadians received the news that one of the lions of Canadian politics had left us. Prime Minister Brian Mulroney served in this chamber for a decade, but he served Canada his entire life. He loved this country with his whole heart, and he knew we were capable of great things. He saw that the greatest strength of this country was our shared values: opportunity, fairness, and justice for all, was one of the ways he put it. But he also understood that success was not automatic. It took hard work. C'est grâce à son éthique de travail que le fils d'un ouvrier de Baie-Comeau a pu faire des études en droit, diriger la compagnie minière IOC et devenir Premier ministre de notre grand pays. Fièrement québécois, fièrement bilingue, il n'a jamais oublié d'où il venait. Il était toujours heureux de serrer la main de tout le monde avec le même enthousiasme, que vous soyez travailleur ou monarque.
Whether it was a housewife, a worker, or a monarch.
To be with Prime Minister Mulroney was at his alma mater, St. FX, last year. Brian and Mila took me on a tour of Mulroney Hall, a beautiful building that houses an institute of government in his name. We sat in a replica of the Prime Minister's Centre Bloc office, and I reminisced not just about my own years in that office, but about visiting my dad there. And that got us talking about families and the impact that this life has on them. And then, as we walked, we talked about wisdom that he and my dad both shared, that leadership, fundamentally, is about getting the big things right. No matter what your political stripe or your style, that's your job. À l'une des occasions où il a parlé aux funérailles d'un président américain, il a souligné qu'il y a plusieurs personnes aux talents et aux compétences variées qui ont dirigé le pays et qu'il y en aura beaucoup d'autres dans l'avenir. Une chose est sûre, mes chers amis, les historiens vont voir que dans l'histoire du Canada, Brian Mulroney a su diriger avec vision et détermination, parce qu'il a accompli bien de grandes choses. We see it in his legacy on apartheid, where he was unremitting in his commitment to end that institutionalized racism. And he leveraged Canada's position in the Commonwealth to lead efforts that helped free Nelson Mandela from his cell on Robben Island. Nous le voyons dans l'héritage qu'il a laissé en matière d'environnement. Il a compris la responsabilité des gouvernements de lutter contre la dégradation de l'environnement et il a négocié avec les États-Unis un accord historique sur la qualité de l'air pour lutter contre les pluies acides. Et avec des partenaires mondiaux, il a négocié le protocole de Montréal pour réparer le trou dans la couche d'ozone. Ces accords n'étaient pas juste essentiels pour le moment, ils sont devenus d'importants modèles de coopération environnementale à l'heure où la communauté internationale est confrontée à la crise climatique. And perhaps one of his greatest legacies was forging a free trade agreement with our closest ally, the United States. Prime Minister Mulroney was astute and perceived even back in the 80s a rising tide of American protectionism. He had the wisdom to understand that the best way to fight back was to embrace our friends. He envisioned a free trade relationship, and in working to make this vision a reality, he became a lifelong friend of two American presidents. With the creation of NAFTA, Brian Mulroney established the largest free trade area in the world and raised the standard of living for hundreds of millions of people, benefiting Canadians in every corner of this country for decades. Mais Brian savait aussi qu'il ne fallait rien tenir pour acquis.
Brian also knew that you
Il
could take
disait
nothing
qu'il
for
faut
granted.
travailler tous les jours
He would
et
say
tous les jours suivants.
that you had to
Et
work
c'est dans cet
every
même
single
esprit
day and every
qu'il
next
est
day.
intervenu
And
quand
in that
l'ALENA
spirit,
a été menacée il y a quelques années.
he took part when NAFTA was
Brian
threatened a few
a
years
joué
ago.
un double rôle,
He
celui
played a
de
dual role.
conseiller pour mon cabinet et
He
moi-même,
was an advisor for my cabinet
ainsi
and
qu'un
for
rôle
me,
de défenseur du Canada
and he also played a
auprès de
role
ses amis et
as
contacts
a defender
dans
of
l'élite
Canada
politique et d'affaires
among the
des États-Unis.
international and U.S.
It mattered a
political
lot
elite.
to me, but even more so to Canada, that Brian vouched to the American Republican class that they could trust this Liberal Prime Minister. And even given partisan political pressure here at home, he always knew that the most important thing was getting a good deal for Canada and for Canadians. In our many, many conversations during that difficult time, he was gracious, generous, insightful, and determined to see Canada come out on top. NAFTA was created as an act of hope. So too was its renegotiation. Hope not just in the continual economic progress of this country, but hope that those values that once held us together, opportunity and fairness for all, livelihood above gimmicks, country above politics, that those values could still be the thing. Politics is not an easy life. Last June, after he walked me around the exhibits that the Institute formed in his name, Brian gave a speech that history is unconcerned with the trivia and the trash of rumors and gossip floating around Parliament Hill. History is only concerned with the big-ticket items that have shaped the future of Canada. Prenons tous un moment pour réfléchir à ce qu'on veut accomplir ici dans cette chambre. Rappelons-nous à quel point c'est important de prendre des bonnes décisions, indépendamment des tendances populaires, des décisions qui résistent à l'épreuve du temps. Nobody who runs for office doesn't want to win. Brian Mulroney knew how to win, and he certainly enjoyed it. And he knew as well as anyone that there would be attacks and criticisms that stung. Mila, Caroline, Ben, Mark, Nicholas, you saw it up close, and you know how hard it can be. But on the big things, you also know full well he wouldn't let himself succumb to temporary pressure. He was motivated by service. And those things, those big things, have stood the test of history, 4 decades and counting. Today, we all gather to remember him in this house, and this weekend, Canadians across the country will say goodbye. But this will not be the last week that Canadians will quote him, remember his example, and be inspired by his service. It is not just his booming baritone that will forever echo in this chamber, but his values and his leadership. Nous disons au revoir à l'homme.
We are saying goodbye to the man, but not to his conviction to put country before politics, his conviction to create possibilities, and his confidence in the infinite possibility of Canada.
Brian Mulroney's principles helped shape this nation and the world for the better, and we will all continue that work. Merci beaucoup.
L'honorable chef de l'opposition, the honorable leader of the opposition.
I rise today in the House to honor a son of Quebec and a great man from Canada.
About a year ago, my wife Anna and I were at a mechanic shop servicing our car about 30 minutes south of here. And as I went to pay, the mechanic said, "Oh, I hear that conservative leader, you know, Brian Mulroney is a family friend of mine." And I said, "Oh, really? How do you know Brian Mulroney?" And he said, "Well, my dad was a miner at the iron ore company. And when Brian was the president, he used to spend a lot of time with the guys on the ground and ask their opinions, hear their stories, and most of all, get tips on how they could be running a better business." This was the kind of down-to-earth spirit that he brought, but more importantly than that spirit and collegiality with the workers on the ground was his incredible memory. You see, when that miner passed away, decades later, Brian called the family. What is so incredible about that phone call is that in the interim period, Brian Mulroney fought 2 leadership races, won 2 majority governments, shook hands and spent time with presidents, kings, queens, and other prime ministers, negotiated free trade deals, watched the end of the Cold War, sent our troops into the Persian Gulf, and with all that passing through his mind, he still remembered the miner from the iron ore company. That is kindness. That is humility. And you know where I think it came from? I think in that miner, he saw his dad, an electrician from a working class small town in Quebec, d'une ville travaillante au Québec.
From a working class town in Quebec.
Baie-Comeau.
Baie-Comeau.
A modest Irish working class upbringing taught him the value of work, family, neighborhood, loyalty, and merit. For me, this part of his legacy is personal. I was born to a teenage mother, incidentally, she was from a working class Irish family. She put me up for adoption to 2 school teachers. And I was just becoming aware that there was such a thing as Prime Minister when he had that job. And like millions of young people from similar backgrounds, we looked to him and said, if the Irish son of a working class electrician from a mill town can rise to become Prime Minister, then in this country, anyone from anywhere can do anything. He took his journey from a small town to big business, leading some of the great enterprises of Canada. Many of these jobs he had in his late 30s and early 40s. His first shot at politics came with a setback, but he would brush aside that setback with a second run for leadership, which he would win before he could take on the mighty Liberal machine in the forthcoming 1984 election. Before he could do that, he had to come to this place. And on his first day in the House, he squared off with the legendary Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who teased him about parachuting from his corporate office in Montreal into a by-election win in rural Nova Scotia. If you'll allow me to quote the records, Mr. Speaker, the member from Central Nova has come a long way from that log cabin in Pictou County. I see he has put away his rumpled trousers and odd sweaters to be brought out again in the next election. But in the meantime, Madam Speaker, it is nice for us in this change to be able to bask in the glow of the benign smile of a man who sent such shivers of pleasure down the spines of the matrons all the way from Oyster Pond to Mushaboom. That's some good stuff. Then Mulroney had to rise and respond, and he said, "I want you to know, Prime Minister, that during the summer, while you were otherwise occupied, there was a very pleasant summer for me. There was one untoward incident, and only one. The Liberal candidate in Central Nova persistently referred to a candidate from Quebec who didn't live in his riding and lived in a $1 million house rent-free. And I want you to know, Prime Minister, I defended you vigorously." And when he appeared in this chamber with that big smile and confident tone, I think it was enough to make anybody take a walk in the snow. Soon after the election, he would go on, soon after he would win a record majority government. And he inherited a desperate, divided country, with skyrocketing debt having caused double-digit inflation, unemployment, and interest rates. Government had attacked industries and thousands of jobs. People's lives were falling apart. The country was more divided than ever before, with rocketing separatism and Western alienation. Yet he set out to do his work. He shrunk government, cut red tape, ended the appalling National Energy Program, privatized 23 money-losing state enterprises that went on to succeed and grow in the private sector. And to put any debate to rest, successive governments refused to renationalize any of them, proving that he was right. My personal favorite, he brought in the inflation control target, which required the Bank of Canada to keep our money solid, ending the prior decade of money printing inflation that had destroyed the working class. This policy, this inflation target, came in 1991 and would succeed in giving us price stability and sound money for 2.5 decades that followed. Finally, he stared down fear-mongering and falsehoods to defend and secure the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, the most successful trade agreement the modern world had ever seen, with the most lucrative economy in the history of the planet. In fact, all of the trade access and more than we have today with the United States was secured in that agreement. Il a hérité d'un pays désespéré, divisé.
He inherited a desperate, divided country with public debt that had caused inflation, high unemployment, and increased interest rates. The government was attacking the private sector and had destroyed thousands of jobs. People's lives were falling apart, but he gave people hope. And yet, he sat down to the difficult task of reducing the size of government, reducing red tape, ending the terrible National Energy Program, and he privatized 23 state companies. These companies succeeded in the private sector, and successive governments have not renationalized any of those businesses. And as such, they've recognized that he was right. And my favorite was his decision to put in place a requirement to keep inflation low, to give that mandate to the central bank, 2.2%. That ended the money printing that had destroyed the working class in the previous decade. He put that policy in place in 1991, and it's a policy that has been respected, or was respected, for the following 25 years. Finally, he stood up for the idea of free trade with the United States, with an agreement that has been the most successful of all free trade agreements in the world, with an extraordinary economy. His economic policies created a consensus of good common sense, of free markets, of free trade, of disciplined spending, of a solid currency, of strong defense, and of a meritocracy and not an aristocracy. A consensus which lasted another 30 years following his election in 1984.
All of the policies that he put forward, the ones I've named, all of them were controversial. Some were even unpopular, and yet none of them were repealed by the subsequent Liberal government. He, in fact, started in 1984, after his election, a common-sense consensus of free markets, free trade, disciplined spending, sound money, strong defense, meritocracy, and not aristocracy, a consensus that would endure for 30 years after his 1984 election, and one that we should restore. Il s'est battu pour la langue française.
He fought for the French language,
pour le Québec,
and for respect for Quebec, for provincial autonomy. He did away with Cold War neutrality and instead sided firmly and unequivocally with freedom and against communism.
He led the world in the fight against apartheid. Nelson Mandela would later tell this House of Commons, and I will quote, "I would also like to pay special tribute to the Prime Minister of this country, Brian Mulroney, who has continued along the path charted by Prime Minister Diefenbaker, who acted against apartheid because he knew that no person of conscience could stand aside as a crime against humanity was being committed. Prime Minister Mulroney, our people and organization respect and admire you as a true friend. We have been greatly strengthened by your involvement in the struggle against apartheid and the leadership that you have provided. He stood for the freedom at home as well. He stood on the side of turban-wearing Sikhs by allowing them to serve in the RCMP, where they keep us safe to this day. He was brilliant at talking through a microphone, but even better at talking through a telephone. In fact, for Brian Mulroney, phone calls were like an art form, using the telephone the way Michelangelo might have used a chisel or a brush. He would do it to make business deals, charm foreign leaders, and more importantly, to comfort grieving or suffering friends. I've lost count of the number of people who've told me about the worst day in their lives. They might have lost a loved one or a friend or suffered a terrible public humiliation. And then suddenly the phone would ring. And that would be that mellifluous baritone on the other end of the line. It's Brian Mulroney. He would console, joke, and maybe even throw in the odd curse about the unfairness of it all. And his friend's turmoil melted into the astonishment that one of the country's greatest prime ministers had offered love and laughter. I would call and seek his advice. In fact, I was very blessed to receive it. I asked him, for example, what is it that he did to deal with all the strain of the job, the anticipation of a close election, the worry about the fate of a political battle? His answer was not that he studied Stoicism or mastered yoga or meditated on a hilltop, or even that he was a tough guy that had no worries in the world. No, he explained to me very simple, that he surmounted worry through one word, Mila. Mila Mulroney. His half-century-long love affair with Mila is one for the ages. They would have been married 52 years in just a short time. He credited her with all his victories. She was his closest advisor, his rock. Only days before he died, he embraced her, and even with his failing eyes, as she recounted to me the other day, he looked her straight in the face and said, "You are so beautiful." They were inseparable from the moment they met until he took his last breath. He would tell me that my wife, Anaida, who shared Mila's beautiful immigrant story, was my superpower. After my recent convention speech, he said, "My speech was terrific, but Anna's was far, far better." Clapping a little bit too loudly. Anna and I were happy to host the Mulroneys as our first guests at Stornoway after taking on these functions, and we were able to plunder both of their minds for incredible advice, which I will not reveal here because I do not want any of my political competitors to take advantage of them. But the best and most important advice was to stand with family. Brian and Mila's achievements are greatest when it comes to their kids, who tell stories even today that they could call Brian at any time, and he would take the calls even when he was Prime Minister. Later, they would find out that he had left world summits or cabinet meetings to talk with them. And that is why Mark, Caroline, Nicholas, and Ben have been such smashing successes in their own right. And they are now parents themselves, 16 grandchildren. Go forth and multiply indeed. And so he lived out the words of Kipling, which I will summarize and paraphrase. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. If you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too. If you can bear to hear the truth you've spoken, twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools. Or watch the things you gave your life to, broken, and stoop down and build them up with worn-out tools. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings nor lose your common touch. Yours is the earth and everything in it, and, which is more, you'll be a man, my son. Rest in the peace of God, Prime Minister Mulroney. Thank you.
L'honorable
The
député
honourable
de
member for
Baie-Comeau,
Nicholas
Sorel.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
J'ai de bons souvenirs
I
lorsque
have
je parle de ce Premier ministre,
great memories
puisque j'avais été,
of this Prime
j'ai
Minister.
été élu en même
I
temps
was
que lui
elected at the same
dans son
time as he
équipe
was on
en
his team
1984,
in
le 4
1984
septembre.
on September 4th.
C'était un grand Canadien,
He was a great
un
Canadian
grand Québécois,
and a great Quebecer,
un grand Premier ministre.
a great Prime Minister.
Au nom du Bloc Québécois,
On behalf of the
d'abord,
Bloc
je
Québécois,
tiens
first
à
of all,
offrir mes plus
I
sincères
offer my
condoléances
sincerest
à son
condolences
épouse Mila,
to his wife Mila,
à sa fille
his daughter
Caroline,
Caroline,
à ses fils Ben,
his sons
Marc et
Ben,
Nicolas,
Mark and Nicholas,
ainsi que ses petits-enfants.
and his grandchildren.
Je me souviens de Brian
remember
Mulroney
Brian
comme
Mulroney
étant d'abord
as
un
being
père de
first
famille.
and foremost
Il
a
adorait
family
Mila,
man.
son
He
épouse
loved
et
Mila,
compagne de
his
toujours.
wife and lifelong
Il était
companion.
fier de ses
He was so
enfants
proud of his children,
et chérissait son
and
rôle
he
de
cherished his
grand-père.
role as a grandfather.
Il n'était toujours qu'à un coup de fil de
He
ses
was never
proches.
more than a phone call
Il
away
se
from his
réjouissait
family,
de passer de bons
and
moments
I know
avec
how
toute
much he
la
loved
famille.
spending time with his
Issu
family.
d'une famille ouvrière,
Born into a
M.
working-class
Mulroney
family,
a grandi sur la
Mr.
côte nord
Mulroney
du Québec,
grew up on the North Shore
dans
of
la ville
Quebec,
papetière
in the paper-making
de
town
Baie-Comeau.
of Baie-Comeau.
Doté d'une solide éthique de travail,
He had an incredibly strong
M.
work
Mulroney
ethic,
s'est hissé
and
au
Mr.
plus haut
Mulroney rose to
échelons
the highest
des
echelons
milieux du droit
of
et des
the
affaires
legal and
de
business
Montréal dans
communities
les
in
années
Montreal in the
70,
1970s,
devenant même
to the
président
point that he
directeur
even
général
became
d'une grande
CEO
entreprise
of a major
avant
corporation
d'atteindre la
in
quarantaine.
his 30s.
Dès son jeune âge, cependant, il s'intéresse à la vie politique
From an
du
early
Québec
age,
et du
he
Canada,
took particular interest in politics
animé
in
par un
Quebec and
désir
Canada,
profond
driven by
d'édifier
a
un
deep
Québec
desire
et
to
un
build
Canada moderne
a modern Quebec
Il se
and a
lancera
modern Canada.
dans l'arène
He threw
politique
himself into the political
plutôt
arena
que d'être un
instead
simple
of standing
observateur.
by simply as an
En
observer.
1984, M.
In
Mulroney à la
1984,
tête du Parti
Mr.
progressiste
Mulroney
conservateur,
led the now
un
defunct
parti qui
Progressive
aujourd'hui
Conservative
n'existe
Party
plus.
to the greatest
Il
election
remportera la
victory.
plus
This
grande
party no
victoire
longer exists,
électorale de
but
l'histoire.
he led them to the greatest
Il
election victory in
entreprend
history. He
immédiatement
immediately embarked
de grandes
on
réformes de
major
l'économie
reforms
canadienne.
in the Canadian
L'ENA,
economy,
privatisation de
NAFTA,
sociétés d'État,
privatization of state-owned
politique
companies,
de faible
a
inflation,
policy of
de
low inflation,
déréglementation
deregulation,
et de
and
réduction des
spending
dépenses
cuts,
et installation de la
and the introduction
TPS.
of the GST.
Ce père du libre-échange
This father of
nord-américain
North
qui
American
jouera
free
un rôle
trade,
névralgique
who would
dans la
play a
vitalité
pivotal role
économique
in
du Québec
Quebec's economic
en tant que
vitality as
nation
a creative,
créatrice et
exporting
exportatrice,
nation,
fera en sorte que
would
moins de 2 ans après la
see
réalisation de l'ALENA,
unemployment
le
fall
chômage au
from
Québec passera de
12 to
12%
6%
à
in Quebec less than
6%.
2 years later.
On se rappellera du rôle clé qu'a joué sa
We
personnalité
remember his
engageante
engaging personality,
dans le
which played a
dans le
pivotal role
resserrement
in strengthening
de
the important
l'importante relation
relationship between
qu'entretiennent
Canada
le
and the
Canada
United
et les
States.
États-Unis. Comment oublier que c'est
How
dans
could
la
we
ville de
forget that it was in
Québec,
Quebec
à
City
la Sainte-Patrick,
on St. Patrick's Day,
qu'hier certains célébraient,
which many were celebrating
que ce
yesterday,
rapprochement a été consacré
that
lorsque M.
bonds were
Mulroney
strengthened when
reçut
Mr.
le
Mulroney received
président Ronald
President
Reagan au
Ronald
Grand
Reagan
Théâtre.
at the Grand
Fidèles
Théâtre.
à leurs
True to
origines,
their
à la fois
Québécois and
québécoises et
Irish
irlandaises,
origins,
c'est évidemment en chantant
they
que
were,
cette
of course,
amitié a été
singing
consacrée
a song.
quand les deux chefs d'État sur le théâtre
Their
ont
friendship was
entamé
built when these two heads of state launched into When Irish Eyes Are
Brian
Smiling.
Mulroney
Brian
avait
Mulroney
persisté et gagné son
persisted
défi
and won
de
the
l'ALENA.
NAFTA challenge.
À propos d'une anecdote à ce moment-là,
One
je me rappelle
anecdote
que le
on
Premier
the
ministre de l'Ontario,
opposition of the Premier
tout
of
le temps de
Ontario,
cette négociation,
throughout these
s'était
negotiations,
opposé carrément
they
à
were
cet alinéa-là
vigorously
avaient
opposed
fait
to
des
NAFTA.
discours à n'en plus finir.
They made
Et
endless
pourtant,
speeches. And
lors
yet,
d'un caucus 3 mois
during a
après que la
3-month
signature ait eu
caucus
lieu,
after the
M.
NAFTA signature
Mulroney
took
s'était
place, Mr.
présenté avec
Mulroney
une revue devant le caucus, parce qu'à chaque caucus, il
presented
faisait
himself before the
un petit
caucus.
discours
He
de
used to do a
motivation
motivational
que
speech before every
les anglophones appelaient un pep
caucus,
talk.
which the
Et
Anglophones
il
called
avait
a pep
sorti la
talk.
revue,
And
l'avait montré,
he showed
l'avait
the
ouvert à la
caucus.
page
Well, he
6
opened up to page
7,
6 or 7 of
et
the
on voyait
review.
dans cette revue américaine d'affaires la photo du premier
They
ministre
saw
de
the
l'Ontario.
photo of the Premier
Il y
of
a un
Ontario,
message.
and there was a
Grâce
message.
au libre-échange,
Thanks to free
vous pouvez
trade,
maintenant investir en
We can
Ontario.
now invest in Ontario.
3 mois après.
3 months
Alors,
later.
M. Mulroney,
So Mr. Mulroney
au sens de l'humour, avait
had a
montré
sense of
cette
humor
chose-là,
and
mais
showed
n'avait
this
fait aucun commentaire contre le premier
and made
ministre de
no
l'Ontario.
comments
Il
against the
avait
Premier of
ce profond
Ontario.
respect de ses adversaires, mais avait un
He had
sens
a
de
deep
l'humour
respect for his
très bien raffiné.
adversaries, but also had a
Au
very
sujet de
deep
la
sense of humor.
TPS,
And when it came
alors
to the
là,
GST,
l'opposition était
yes, opposition
virulente.
was virulent.
Ça venait de partout,
It came from everywhere,
même de notre caucus
even within our
progressiste
own
conservateur.
progressive conservative
Certains membres
caucus.
du caucus ont même
Some
démissionné
members
pour aller
even
siéger
quit
comme indépendants.
and decided to sit as
Et
independents.
j'étais certain
And I was
d'être réélu
sure
comme indépendant
that I
en
would be
prononçant
re-elected
seulement
as an
le mot
independent candidate
TPS. Tant
by just saying the word
qu'ils
GST.
sentaient que bien des gens dans la population s'opposaient
We felt that a
à
lot
cette
of
réforme-là.
people were against that
Mais Brian
reform. But Brian
Mulroney
Mulroney
ne faiblit pas.
did not
Il
waver.
persiste.
He persisted.
Il persiste et met en place la
He did
TPS.
implement the
Et aujourd'hui,
GST. And today,
personne ne voudrait changer cela.
no one want to change that.
N'oublions pas que les compagnies exportatrices,
Exporting
à ce
companies
moment, payaient une
then
taxe
used to pay a
sur les
tax
marchandises qu'ils
on the goods
exportaient.
that they exported.
C'était
And
tout
this
à
was
fait anormal.
absolutely
Et ça,
abnormal.
Brian Mulroney
And Brian
avait
Mulroney
promis de le
promised
corriger.
to end that.
Et il a réussi.
And he did do
On se
so.
rappellera qu'il était capable
Let's not forget he was
de
capable
concilier
of
une approche économique
reconciling
ouverte,
an open
et de
economic
confiance dans les
approach
marchés,
and
mais capable
confidence
aussi
in the markets,
de
but also
leadership
able,
mondial en
capable
matière
of world leadership
d'environnement.
in environmental
Il
matters.
signera un traité
He
canado-américain sur les
signed
pluies
a
d'acide.
Canada-US
Les pluies
treaty on
d'acide,
acid rain,
il sera à l'origine du
and
protocole
he was
de
behind the
Montréal
Montreal
relatif aux
Protocol
substances qui
on
affaiblissent la couche d'ozone.
substances that deplete the
Ce qui
ozone
fera de
layer.
lui
This
le
made
premier
him
ministre le plus vert.
the greenest
Les relations
prime minister ever.
internationales qu'il établira, ses
International
talents
relations he
négociateurs
established,
et son
his
continuel
negotiation
désir de
skills,
consensus
his continual
lui ont
desire for
permis d'exercer
consensus enabled
une
him to
influence
exert
sur la
influence
scène
on the international
internationale.
stage.
Il fut un des premiers
He was one of the
à
first
réagir à la famine
to react
en
to the
Égypte
famine
en 1984. Il a
Ethiopia
mené
in
la campagne
1984.
contre l'apartheid en
He
Afrique du
led
Sud.
the campaign against
Étant
apartheid in South
le Canada
Africa,
étant
being
le
the first
premier
Commonwealth
pays
country
à
to
imposer des
impose
sanctions
economic sanctions
économiques
on
à
that
ce
country,
pays, malgré
despite
l'opposition
opposition from
formulée par
Margaret
Mme Thatcher et le
and the
président
American
américain.
president
Ces
at
actions
the time.
devaient
His
conduire à la
actions,
libération de Mandela.
led
Il fut
to
également
Nelson
très
Mandela's
actif
release.
et même chef
And
de
he was
file
also very
de
active and a
l'Organisation
leader
internationale
in the
de la
International
francophonie.
Organization of the
En
Francophonie.
plus des plus hautes
In
distinctions
addition to the highest
décernées
honors
par le Québec
bestowed by
et par
Quebec
le
and
Canada,
Canada,
il a reçu les
he
plus hautes
received
distinctions
the
de
highest
nombreux pays,
distinctions from many
dont de la
countries,
France, où il
including
fut nommé
France, where he was named
commandeur de la Légion
commander of the
d'honneur,
Legion of
en
Honor.
Afrique du Sud,
In South Africa,
compagnon suprême
Supreme
de ORC
Companion
Tambo,
of the OR
au Japon,
Tambo. In
grand
Japan,
cordon de l'ordre
Grand
du
Cordon
Soleil
of the
levant,
Order of the Rising
en
Sun.
Haïti,
In Haiti,
grande croix de
Haiti,
l'origine
Grand
de l'ordre
Cross
national
of the National
honneur et
Order
mérite,
of Honor and
et en
Merit.
Ukraine,
And in Ukraine, Order of
reçoit l'ordre du roi
King Laroslav
le Sage.
the
Donc,
Wise.
il était reconnu
He
internationalement.
was
Il y a des
recognized
éléments
internationally.
de la vie politique de Brian
There
Mulroney
are elements of
dont la nation
Brian Mulroney's
québécoise,
political life
elle,
that
se souviendra
Quebec will
toujours
always
plus que
remember
quiconque
more than
et que
anyone
trop de
else,
gens
and that too
ont
many
oublié
have since
depuis,
forgotten
sinon balayé sous
or
le
even
tapis.
swept under the carpet.
Il s'était donné la
He
mission de
took it upon
transformer
himself to
presque à
transform
lui
almost
seul la
single-handedly
relation alors
the
historiquement
then historically
difficile
difficult
et méfiante
and
entre le
distrustful
Québec et son
relationship
parti.
between Quebec and his
Puis,
party.
comme premier
And
ministre de
then, as
84 à
the
93,
Prime Minister from
les
1984 to
Québécois n'oublieront
1993,
jamais
Quebecers
qu'il
will never
fut
forget
le
that he was
dernier
the
à
last
avoir tenté,
to
avec
make
ardeur
a
et
sincere and ardent
sincérité,
attempt
à
to
réconcilier le Québec
reconcile
et le
Quebec and
Canada.
Canada.
Brian Mulroney a
Brian
eu le
Mulroney
courage de
had the
bâtir
courage
sa
to build
campagne
his winning campaign
victorieuse de 84 sur le respect des Québécois
of
et de
1984
leur
on
fierté.
respect for
Il
Quebecers
a
and their
gagné
pride.
avec l'appui
He
des
won with the support
plus
of the most
nationalistes d'entre eux.
nationalistic
René
amongst
Lévesque lui a
us,
accordé sa
René
confiance
Lévesque,
au
who put
lendemain
his
du
trust in him the
référendum
day
de
after the
80.
1980
Lucien
referendum.
Bouchard lui a
Lucien
accordé sa
Bouchard
confiance
placed his
également.
trust in him
Et
as well.
soulignons au passage que la
remember
nouvelle de leur
that the
réconciliation
news of their
récente,
recent
quelques mois
reconciliation
avant son décès,
put
a
a
mis un
smile on
baume
the faces
au
of many
cœur
Quebecers.
de beaucoup de Québécois. La majorité des Québécois
Most
lui ont
Quebecers
accordé leur confiance.
put their trust in him.
Je lui ai accordé ma
And I
confiance
placed my
lorsque
trust
j'ai
in
été
him when I
élu
was
en
elected
cette chambre
to
à ses
this house
côtés en 84.
alongside him in
J'avais la
1984.
certitude,
I
comme une
was
majorité
certain,
de Québécois,
like many,
qu'il
the
était
majority of
l'homme de la
Quebecers,
main à
that
la main
he
suffisamment sûre pour
was
diriger
able
le
to lead with a
gouvernement
steady
qui
hand
conduirait au
and lead
respect
the
des
government
aspirations du Québec.
that would fulfill Quebec's
Il s'est promis
aspirations.
et il nous
He
a
promised
promis
himself and
que
promised
la
us
fourberie entourant
that
le
the deceit
rapatriement de la Constitution
surrounding
de
the
82
patriation of the
ne
1982
scellait pas
Constitution
la suite
would
des
not
relations entre le Québec et
seal
le
the future
Canada.
of relations between
Que le
Quebecers and
Québec pouvait prendre
Canadians,
sa
that
place comme
Quebec
peuple
could
au sein
take
de
its
cette
place as a
Constitution
people
et de cette fédération
within this
avec
Constitution and
honneur et
Federation with
enthousiasme,
honor
comme
and
il disait.
enthusiasm, he said.
Il avait même utilisé
Even used
la parole qu'il avait
the term
décochée à John Turner lors du premier
he
débat,
took from John
que le
Turner during his
Québec
first
avait une
debate
option,
that Quebec
vous vous
had
rappelez
an
sans
option.
doute. Et cette ouverture aux
And
Québécois
this
n'a
openness
pas nui à M. Mulroney.
to Quebecers
Au
did not hurt
contraire,
Mr. Mulroney,
son
quite the
engagement
contrary.
nationaliste lui a
His
permis,
nationalist
à sa
commitment
première
enabled
élection
him
comme
in
chef,
his first
de
election as
remporter
leader
pas moins de
to win no less
211
than
sièges sur
211 of the
282 à
then
l'époque,
282
dont
seats,
57
including
au Québec.
57 in Quebec.
Puis, il s'est fait à nouveau
He was then
réélire
re-elected
majoritairement en
with a majority
88.
in
C'était
1988.
la première fois depuis la
And this was the first
Confédération
time since
que le Parti
Confederation that the
progressiste
Progressive
conservateur
Conservative
était
Party
élu 2 fois
won
de suite
back-to-back
majoritaire.
majority
Chaque
elections.
fois, en assumant une
Every
promesse
time
qu'on n'entend plus
on a
d'action,
promise
qu'on n'attend plus d'action d'aucun parti
that
fédéral
no federal party is
en
expected
2024.
to make in
Plus
2024,
personne ne parle de
namely
cette promesse. Réformer le
to
Canada
reform Canada,
pour y inclure la dignité,
to include Quebec
avec dignité le Québec.
with dignity.
À quelques kilomètres à peine de cette
Just a few
chambre,
kilometers
au
from
bord
this
du lac
house, on the
Peach,
shores of
il
Meech
avait
Lake,
réussi à convaincre tous
he
les premiers
succeeded in
ministres des
convincing all the
provinces
premiers of
canadiennes
Canada's provinces
de le suivre dans ce pari,
to follow him
en
in his
plus de
gamble.
convaincre tous les chefs
He
d'opposition au
also convinced
fédéral.
all the federal
Tous
opposition
étaient
leaders.
prêts
They were
à
all ready
reconnaître le Québec en tant
to
que
recognize
nation
Quebec as a
distincte.
distinct
Tous étaient
nation.
prêts à
They were all
limiter le
ready
pouvoir
to
de
limit
dépenser du
federal
fédéral.
spending power.
Tous étaient prêts à
They were all
garantir au
ready
Québec
to
un
guarantee
droit de
Quebec the
retrait
right to
avec
opt
pleine
out
compensation
of
des programmes
federal
fédéraux.
programs with full
Brian
compensation.
Mulroney
Brian
aimait
Mulroney
profondément le Canada,
loved Canada
comme il
deeply,
aimait profondément le
as much as he
Québec.
loved
C'était
Quebec
pourquoi
deeply.
il a
And
tout
this is
fait pour
why he
que le
did everything
Québec
he could
y sente chez lui.
to make Quebec
Il
feel
a
at
tout
home.
donné et tout
He
tenté
gave
pour
and tried
façonner un
everything
meilleur
to shape a
Canada,
better
une
Canada, a
véritable
true
fédération,
federation,
unie dans le respect
united
mutuel
in mutual
et la
respect
célébration
and
de
celebration
ses
of its
identités
founding
fondatrices.
identities.
Ce qu'il a tenté, malheureusement,
What he tried,
personne
unfortunately,
ne l'a tenté
no one
depuis.
has tried since.
Pendant les années
During the
où
years
j'ai eu l'honneur
I
et le
had the honor and
privilège
privilege
de
of
siéger
serving
sous
under
ses
him,
ordres, j'ai côtoyé un véritable homme
I
d'État,
came into contact with a true
un homme de vision,
statesman,
que
a man of
rien
vision,
ne pouvait
who would stop at nothing to achieve
empêcher
the goals
d'atteindre les buts qu'il
he
s'était
set out for
fixés.
himself.
Un homme affable,
a man who was affable, respectful of his
qui
opponents,
n'avait qu'un grand
and
objectif,
who had only one great objective,
améliorer la vie des
that is to improve
Québécois
the
et
lives
des
of
Canadiens.
Quebecers and Canadians.
Mon cher Brian,
My dear Brian,
nous avions gravé ton nom
we had engraved your name
sur les arbres
on the trees,
de la colline,
on the
mais le
hill,
temps aujourd'hui
but
a fait tomber l'écorce.
time today
Nous
has
avions
removed the
gravé ton nom
bark. We
sur
had
les trottoirs
engraved your
de la
name on the
colline,
sidewalk
mais le
of the
temps
hill,
aujourd'hui
but today,
a
time
cassé le
today
ciment.
has broken the
Mais
cement.
heureusement,
But fortunately,
nous avions gravé ton nom
we engraved your
dans nos
name
cœurs
in our hearts,
et le temps le
and time
gardera
will keep it
à
there
jamais.
forever.
Adieu, Monsieur le Premier ministre. Et merci.
Farewell, Prime Minister, and thank you.
L'honorable député de Burnaby
honourable
Sud,
member for
the honourable
Burnaby
member
South.
from Burnaby South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to offer my sincere condolences on behalf of all New Democrats to the family and friends of former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. It's never easy to lose someone you love, and our thoughts are with you. To Canadians, he was a Prime Minister, but to those closest to him, he was a father, a grandfather, and a husband. I hope his loved ones can find some comfort in the many memories that people have shared about him as they grieve this loss. Prime Minister Mulroney will be remembered as someone who took big chances while he was in office. While there are a great many issues that, of course, he and I would not agree on, I want to acknowledge the legacy that he leaves behind after a long career of dedicated public service. I would be remiss not to point out that Mr. Mulroney was a progressive conservative. He respected our democracy and the role of the media in a way that wasn't remarkable at the time, but is no doubt noteworthy today.
Il était également un grand défenseur des droits de la personne sur la scène internationale. Brian Mulroney a dénoncé haut et fort les injustices de l'apartheid en Afrique du Sud à une époque où de nombreux dirigeants mondiaux restaient silencieux. Sa position ferme nous rappelle qu'il ne faut jamais fermer les yeux sur les difficultés auxquelles sont confrontées les populations au monde. Et des milliers de Canadiennes et Canadiens se souviendront toujours que M. Mulroney n'a pas ignoré cette violation flagrante des droits de la personne. Il a choisi d'utiliser sa voix pour aider seuls et ceux qui souffraient de l'apartheid. Non par son propre gain politique, mais parce que c'était la bonne chose à faire.
I also want to note Prime Minister Mulroney's environmental advocacy. He listened to the concerns raised by scientists about the hole in the ozone layer and the impacts it would have on Canadians, including higher rates of cancer. He responded to scientists' warning about acid rain and the damage it could have on our soil and our ability to grow food. Mr. Mulroney understood that if there wasn't responsible stewardship of our environment, Canadians' health would suffer. He understood that government played a significant role in ensuring people had clean water to drink and clean air to breathe for generations to come. In addition to his dedication to environmental advocacy, the former Prime Minister was also a champion for Quebec and Quebecers, as many have shared. Pour lui, c'était important que la population québécoise soit reconnue. Il valorisait la culture, le patrimoine et la société distincte des Québécoises et Québécois comme partie intégrante du pays. Il a défendu les droits linguistiques des francophones, contrairement à des premiers ministres avant lui. Monsieur Mulroney a travaillé fort pour établir un pont entre les anglophones et les francophones. Il s'est battu
pour que les francophones ne se sentent pas comme des citoyens de seconde zone, mais comme une partie intégrante du tissu social du pays. Having grown up in Quebec, he recognized that the diversity of our country makes us a richer and stronger nation. At a time of more heightened divisions, where some political leaders try to score points by pitting one group of people against another, Mr. Mulroney will be remembered as someone who tried to build unity. Since he passed away, I heard a media interview with former Prime Minister Kim Campbell, his cabinet colleague and successor. The thing that really stands out is the way she spoke about his willingness to change his mind, to hear other points of view, and to adjust his actions. That Mr. Mulroney had this flexibility and open-mindedness is a testament to his leadership style and his character. And ultimately, Canadians expect this of their political leaders. There are bound, of course, to be disagreements between people with different life experiences and different perspectives, but truly listening and respecting one another should be a baseline for people in political life. And that's a standard that Mr. Mulroney upheld and exceeded. I want to share a story about the former Prime Minister that illustrates my point. Just a couple of months ago, our party lost a legend in our former leader, Ed Broadbent. His passing hit us hard. Ed was, of course, a champion for disenfranchised people, a principled leader, and a wonderful friend. Even though at the time, Mr. Mulroney was in hospital dealing with his own health issues, he still made time to speak to media about his former political rival. He spoke of Ed from the hospital with tremendous respect and kindness. We could have just as easily decided not to do any interviews at all, and it would have been understandable. But that was so generous of him to honor an opponent. It says a lot about him as a leader and as a person. I want to close by reiterating my condolences to the former Prime Minister's loved ones and to thank them all for sharing him with this country. Merci. Thank you.
I see the honourable member from Saanich Gulf Islands rising in her place. Would this be in regard to seek the consent of the House to participate in the statements regarding the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney?
I humbly beg my friends to please let me join by unanimous consent of everyone here, because I love the former Prime Minister so much it's going to kill me if I don't get to say so out loud.
All those opposed to the honourable member moving the motion to speak will please say nay. Agreed. The House has heard the terms of the motion. All those opposed to the motion will please say nay. Carried. The honourable member from Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you. À toute la famille de notre l'ancien Premier Ministre,
former Prime Minister's family, Mila, Mark, Carolyn, my sincerest condolences.
I had the very huge honor and very unlikely event in the life of a very passionate non-conservative to serve as a member of the staff team for the Minister of Environment, and ultimately, over the years, to become a friend of Brian Mulroney. I've never said this to the family, but I used to have this recurring dream after I resigned from the office, and there was a certain amount of bad blood from the other Conservatives, never Brian Mulroney, about me leaving over my minister doing this little thing like breaking the law. And the thing about it was, I had this recurring dream that I kept running up to Brian Mulroney to say, I hope you know I love you. It was weird because I didn't know I felt that way when I was having this dream, but I had it over and over again. And then we got to be friends. And we became friends when I felt compelled as executive director of Sierra Club to write articles to say, look at this legacy, hello. And I was on the jury for who should be the greenest prime minister. And it wasn't close. This was in 2005. It wasn't like there were a lot of prime ministers who had that kind of record. So in thinking about my remarks today, I've decided there's no way I can actually speak to each of the accomplishments of the Mulroney government and of Brian Mulroney quite personally picking up the phone and putting the negotiations to stop the logging of Guayahanas, putting them back into play by calling Bill Vander Zalm and putting, I mean, this was hard work and heavy lifting, and it was personal. Where it came from, I can't tell you, but I know it was profound and real and personal on issue after issue. So I've decided the only way I can get through them is to list them. I can hardly editorialize on the accomplishments because they are so many. But let's start with, under the category of under-promising and over-delivering, the multinational effort to deal with acid rain to actually solve the issue, to make every meeting with the President of the United States of America our single top bilateral issue was an environmental issue. It was acid rain every time. Then it was the ozone layer. We didn't just put in place some ideas. Brian Mulroney quite literally saved all life on Earth when Canada stood up and organized the Montreal Protocol and saved the ozone layer so that now just is no longer being eroded. It's repairing itself. And I was never so proud as to see him at the 30th anniversary of the Montreal Protocol in Montreal when he even mentioned me in his speech there. We were there in the same Congress where it was negotiated in September 1987. The Montreal Protocol is an astonishing accomplishment for this country, but it was Brian Mulroney personally who delivered it. It was the first international conference on the climate crisis in the last week of June 1988, which former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney opened and gave a speech that brought the House down and brought scientists from all around the world to their feet to cheer for what Stephen Schneider, one of the leading climate scientists, said, "My God, this is our Woodstock." Prime Ministers also, Gro Harlem Brundtland of Norway, opened that conference, the first one. But then the work kept going. The work to acknowledge and support the World Commission on Environment and Development and their landmark report, Our Common Future, to lead at the United Nations, to create the Earth Summit for June 1992, to lead with heavy lifting to deliver the Treaty for the Protection of Biological Diversity. And this is one of the hallmarks I was going to mention at the end. The things that Brian Mulroney did, not just standing up to his enemies, that's easy, standing up to his friends. So that when he saved the Biodiversity Convention, and he did quite personally save it, when George Bush tried to kill it, he was standing up to his friends. When he stood up to throw South Africa out of the Commonwealth, he had to stand up to his friend whom he loved, Maggie Thatcher, because it was wrong to ignore apartheid and let South Africa be a member of the Commonwealth family. He stood up against his friends, and he stood up to Ronald Reagan on acid rain, and he delivered an agreement between Canada and the US that actually ended the scourge of acid rain pollution in Canada. He banned lead in gasoline. He banned the herbicide that was carcinogenic, Alachlor. He brought in the environmental legislation we still have, and some of which has been tragically repealed. He brought in the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. He brought in the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. He brought in Canada's only federal water policy, and he created new institutions, only some of which we still have. He brought in the National Roundtable on Environment and Economy. He created the International Institute for Sustainable Development. He created the post of Ambassador for the Environment. He did the early work that led to the creation of the Arctic Council. He brought in the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreements, multilateral agreements between many levels of governments, provinces, and federally. And he brought in the national parks, one after the other, Katitin Park, which was then we called Ellesmere, creating that on Ellesmere Island. Guayahanas, we talked earlier today in the House of the news of what's been done for the Haida, with the Haida Nation in acknowledging their sovereignty. But for Brian Mulroney to fly to Vancouver Island to sign the deal with Premier Vander Zalm, and I'll never forget Pat Carney, another dear friend we lost this year, saying to all the men gathered there, you know, a lot of what you've done in your political careers will be forgotten, but this will last. This will always be remembered. Guayahanas National Park, Canada's Galapagos, personally saved by Brian Mulroney. Yes, all the Haida elders who blocked the logging roads and got arrested can't take the thing away from their courage. But the personal courage of the elders who blocked the logging road would have come to a historical footnote if Brian Mulroney hadn't been willing to get a deal and get Bill Vander Zalm back to the negotiating table. Grasslands National Park, Pacific Rim National Park, Georgian Bay National Park, the early work on the Rouge Valley. Making poverty history, the best international development funding record Canada has ever had, the closest we've ever come to the Pearson target, was under Brian Mulroney when we still had a Canadian International Development Agency. Our funding commitments under Brian Mulroney were the most generous of Canada's whole history in international development, stepping up to respond to the Ethiopian famine. The problem is with this kind of resume, not only can you not pad it, you can't even list it and not run out of time. How did he do all this? Well, he had skills and talents. Being Irish, I can only suspect he actually physically once kissed the Blarney Stone. There's no real way to explain how he could charm the birds out of the trees, but he sure as heck could. And he could make people laugh. I loved his jokes so much. I feel like that old joke where you could just give the punchlines and the family will know which ones were the best. But, do you know who I am? I'm the man who gives out the butter. These were great jokes. They made the timing, his comic timing was perfect. But one thing about Brian Mulroney's humor, and he was great at it, there was never a joke at anyone's expense. There was never a cruel joke. And if there was ever a joke at someone's expense, it was his own self-deprecating humor at his own expense. Talking about the time back in 2005 when he missed the first award dinner for his being the greenest prime minister. And he talked about it later, about being in hospital, and some old guy who looked pretty rough looking at him and saying, "Did you used to be Brian Mulroney?" But he could make, at your lowest moments, he could make you laugh, and that's another thing that I just can't say enough, how grateful I am and how deeply honored I am, and there's no explaining the generosity and the kindness of his heart. That when I was having low moments now and then, I couldn't believe it when my office would say, former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney wants to talk to you on the phone. Are you kidding me? I'd love to tell you what he said, but it's so darn funny, but I really can't repeat it. Dear Brian Mulroney, there aren't any pearly gates anywhere near this place. Like a bat out of hell, one would say, but still, I know where there's a proper welcome and open arms and angelic choirs for someone who deserved and deserves to come home. God bless you and your family and your children and your grandchildren and all who loved you. You lived well and you loved this country. Let us continue to try to meet that example of a good-hearted, kind, spirited, generous, and brilliant Canadian.
Hear, hear.
Chers collègues, je vous remercie pour des paroles, des bons sentiments et du profond respect que vous avez témoigné à l'égard de notre 18e Premier ministre, le très honorable Brian Mulroney. L'histoire de sa vie est digne d'un conte de fées. De ses débuts modestes à Baie-Comeau à un leader qui a fait du Canada et du monde un endroit meilleur. Brian Mulroney a été un exemple de courage, de vision et d'amour du pays. When he died on February 29, it was the last day of Black History Month. And that evening, I took a stage at a final Black History Month event and announced to those assembled the passing of the Right Honourable Gentleman. I reminded the crowd the great debt of gratitude that Black Canadians, indeed what Black people around the world and indeed any freedom-loving people owed Brian Mulroney for his work to end apartheid. For he was a fearless politician who fought for policies that frankly transformed the world. He never wavered from what he believed was right, no matter how hard or how controversial, from fighting apartheid in South Africa to apologizing for the wrongs committed against Japanese Canadians. Brian Mulroney's legacy puts him squarely on the side of justice. His charisma was legendary and made him a statesman like no other, and he was an amazing orator and a consummate network who could make magic happen by picking up the phone. Nous tous, dans cette chambre, pourrions apprendre de sa gentillesse, de son sourire et de sa civilité. Et tout le peuple canadien a bénéficié de son intelligence, de son travail acharné et de son dévouement exemplaire au service public. His love for his beautiful family filled him with an infectious joy that grounded him with what matters most. And we are honored to have his family here with us today. As Canada grieves, we hope that the love and light that he brought to his family and friends and to all who knew him, as well as his indelible contributions to the people around the world and, of course, to our wonderful country, offer strength to his family during this time of sorrow. We will miss him. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I wish to inform the House that because of the ministerial statement, government orders will be extended by 60 minutes. La Chambre va maintenant poursuivre avec le reste de ses travaux sur les affaires courantes. Nous sommes sur la rubrique Reports from Interparliamentary Delegations. Presenting reports from committees. The Honourable Member from Edmonton West.
Mr. Speaker, I have two reports today. First one is in both official languages, the 15th report of the Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates, aka the Mighty Ogo, in relation to the motion adopted on Thursday, February 22nd, 2024, which asks the House to recommend that the Public Sector Integrity Commissioner investigate allegations of wrongdoing related to ArriveCan. Second one, I have the honour to present in both official languages the 16th report of the Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates, entitled Supplementary Estimates C, 2023-2024, votes 1C and 5C under Department of Public Works and Government Services, vote 1C under the Privy Council Office, vote 1C under Shared Services Canada, and votes 1C, 15C, 20C, and 30C under the Treasury Board Secretariat. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Introduction of private members' bills. The Honourable, Mr. Massey, seconded by Mr. Sorbara, votes for leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Establish Turkish Heritage Month. This motion is deemed adopted. The Honourable Member from Windsor West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member from Vaughan Woodbridge for supporting this bill, as well as several other members who have also wanted to second this as well, too. It's an act to amend, establish a Turkish Heritage Month, whereas the first Turks arrived in Canada in the late 1800s, setting in Brantford, Ontario, the year after Confederation, whereas the population of Turkish Canadians has grown considerably and includes people from Turkic nations across the world, whereas young dynamic Turkish Canadians communities across continue to flourish in Canada, and whereas Turkish Canadians have made a rich and significant contribution to the cultural fabric of Canada, including through food, literature, music, and fashion, we are proposing to make the month of October Turkish Heritage Month. And I want to thank the Federation of Canadian Turkish Associations, and particularly Hula Güney, the Vice President of the Federation, and also Dr. Sinan Yasarlar from Windsor, who has been the inspiration for this bill. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I want to say thank you to the Chamber here and for other members that are reaching out on this bill. Hopefully you'll find unanimous consent at some point in time. Turkish Heritage Month is something that's been supported by many different cities and organizations, and believe the House and Chamber would be appropriate to adopt this motion and legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Massey, seconded by Mr. Sobrero, moves that the bill be now read a first time and be printed. This motion is deemed adopted.
First reading of this bill, première lecture de ce projet de loi.
Shall this bill be read a second time at the next sitting of the House? First reading of Senate public bills. Motions. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I ask that members be a little bit patient as they go through this. There have been discussions amongst the parties, and if you seek it, I think you'll find will and unanimous consent to adopt the following motions. I will start with the travel motions relating to 4 committees. That in relation to its study, Canadian business in supply chains and global markets, 7 members of the Standing Committee on International Trade be authorized to travel to Prince Rupert, British Columbia, Winnipeg, Manitoba, Windsor, Ontario, Montreal, Quebec, and Halifax, Nova Scotia in the spring of 2024 during the adjournment proceeding period, and that the necessary staff accompany the committee. That in relation to its study of opioid epidemic and toxic drug crisis in Canada, 7 members of the Standing Committee on Health be authorized to travel to Montreal, Quebec, Vancouver, British Columbia, Calgary, Alberta, and Red Deer, Alberta in the spring of 2024 during an adjournment period, and that the necessary staff accompany the committee. That in relation to its study of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, 7 members of the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs be authorized to travel to New York, United States of America in the spring of 2024 during an adjournment period, and that the necessary staff accompany the committee. Then, Mr. Speaker, that in relation to its study of the growing problem of car thefts in Canada, 7 members of the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security be authorized to travel to Montreal, Quebec in the spring of 2024 during an adjournment period, and that the necessary staff accompany the committee.
All those opposed to the honourable member.
Juste le long d'essayer de mettre le forme dans mes... Non, ça va tenir dans une coupe de mois. Pas de sûr. Comment? Non, ça tenait pas.
Seconds, 2 secondes.
Bonjour. Vous savez sans doute que cette semaine sera très longue pour notre famille, donc on va être très bref. Mais au nom de toute la famille, on aimerait remercier le Premier ministre, le chef de l'opposition, M. Plamondon, M. Singh, et peut-être un remerciement particulier et spécial pour Mme May, pour leurs mots émouvants et leur mémoire personnelle qui nous ont touchés énormément. Merci. I was just going to say we want to thank the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, as well as Mr. Plamondon, Mr. Singh, and I said a special thank you for Ms. May for their really very touching tributes and recollections that mean so much for the family.
How does it feel to hear those tributes today?
I would say that as we kind of think about it, my dad came here when he was a 17-year-old boy for Youth for Deaf, and he kind of was eager to get back here, and he did, and he enjoyed every minute of the back and forth parliamentary process, the debate, and seeing it today and seeing how it was. We obviously understand what drew him here, but what also he loved about it. And for us, sitting up in the gallery and hearing everybody speak so positively, probably not what he was used to, but he would have loved it, and we did as well. And everybody kind of taking the time to think through and to say these positive words, we can't be more thankful. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and just one last point. It's just been incredibly humbling to hear the outpouring of support from friends and former foes. Being the youngest member of the family, this is certainly not something I grew up used to, and it's especially for the grandkids, they get to see and experience something so special. We're truly honored from all of the people across the country and internationally that have taken the time to reach out to say nice things and words of support. So just want to thank everybody on behalf of the family.
Qu'est-ce que vous souhaitez que ces députés-là retiennent de votre père peut-être avant de quitter?
Premièrement, je pense qu'on l'a bien vu et on l'a bien entendu. Ils ont entendu qu'on peut être politicien, mais on peut être aussi collégial et ami avec des autres membres d'autres partis. Et ça, c'était son talent. C'était le cadeau qu'il a amené avec lui tout partout. Et c'était un homme fantastique qui adorait sa participation politique et aussi quelque chose que tous les jours on entend parler des histoires, toutes les histoires où mon père il appelait des personnes puis il le faisait parce qu'il savait que c'était une bonne chose, pas parce qu'il devait le faire. Et je pense que tous les politiciens de tous les côtés, eux, ils entendent la même chose et pour eux peut-être c'est quelque chose à retenir et ramener avec eux pendant qu'ils sont en politique et quand ils partent.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.